President Biden has said that domestic terrorism goes against everything the country stands for and poses a direct challenge to the country's national security, democracy, and unity. In June of last year, the White House released their strategy for countering domestic terrorism. Mollie Saltskog has written an assessment of that strategy. She's a senior intelligence analyst at the Soufan Group. Mollie, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So this national strategy has been out since June of last year. What progress has been made so far?
Well, there have been a couple of very important measures taken by the government in this regard to implement some of the ideas and strategies in the national strategy. And first, the Department of Homeland Security doubled its budget for programs aimed at preventing radicalization to violence. And it also revamped the prevention program to take a more of a public health approach. And that is a very important lesson learned from 20 years of preventing violent extremism. Secondly, the Defense Department held a military-wide stand-down to train everyone in the armed forces on the threat of domestic extremism. And just last month, they actually released new guidelines and policies to deal with the rising threat of extremism in its ranks. And lastly, only earlier this month, the Department of Justice announced that it's forming a specific new unit focused exclusively on the domestic terrorism. So these are all very important implementations that we're seeing.
So there are 4 pillars to the strategy. The first is understanding and sharing domestic terrorism related research. The second is about prevention, stopping the recruitment into organizations and then mobilizing to violence. How do you do that?
That is the million-dollar question that the United States has actually grappled with throughout the 20 years where the focus of the U.S. Counterterrorism apparatus has been largely focused abroad on groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, international terrorist organization. Now, the primary threat, as you mentioned, comes from within. And I think one key here, is taking a public health prevention approach. What we can see, what many experts in this field have also pointed out, is that the narratives that are radicalizing are becoming more and more mainstream. So it's very important to not take a purely law enforcement or intelligence approach. We need that for sure, and the efforts and resources that are devoted to that are very important. And one of the strongest pillars of the strategy is actually sharing with our allies and partners, intelligence and so forth. But when it comes to prevention programs here in the United States, it's very important to target the underlying drivers of extremism and not only, try to arrest our way through this issue.
I wanted to ask you about that because the third pillar is disrupting and deterring terrorism activity, which is mostly the FBI, that's law enforcement. The last pillar is dealing with the long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. Expand on that.
Exactly. That is, perhaps the most ambitious part of this strategy, because it's really going after the long-term, cycles of violence, the root causes of what is radicalizing people. And it is aiming to boost the confidence in democratic institutions, in the government, and bridge polarization and so forth. And here, we haven't seen much progress yet because it's a very long-term part of the strategy. And I think the key here is for the Biden administration to continue evaluating, year after year as the strategy is implemented, what has been effective and what is not so effective, and what do we need to, amend in order to be more effective regarding this fourth pillar.
The strategy emphasizes cooperation with foreign partners and allies, as you had mentioned before. But why is that, given that this is a domestic issue?
Right. And I think that is something that perhaps not most Americans are aware of. But actually, in our research, we have found that a lot of the most violent individuals and organizations in the United States, specifically white supremacy extremist organizations, actually have strong financial, operational, radicalizing ties to like-minded individuals overseas, like in Canada, like in Europe, even as far away as Australia. And therefore, it's very important, and this is part of the strongest part of the strategy, actually, is to continue that the United States is leading in this fight against, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, white supremacy extremism, neo-Nazism on the global stage, as well as we have done in the fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and share intelligence with our allies and partners to combat this threat that is also becoming transnational in nature.
And Mollie, what are the gaps or weaknesses that you see in this national strategy?
Well, that is what I mentioned is that the threat is mainstream and it's coming from within primarily. And without it's a strategy, so it's without recommendations or thresholds for measuring actual success on certain parts of the strategy. And so it will be very essential that the administration continues to work to measure the effectiveness of certain part of the strategy. Where it falls short, it will be key to propose new innovative solutions or workarounds to deal with the most serious risks related to the domestic terrorism threat. And lastly, to not take a purely law enforcement approach. It's very important that these extra resources have been given to the Department of Justice, that they're hiring more analysts, more experts, more prosecutors. That's all very important to prevent it in the short term, prevent the attacks from killing innocent Americans. But in the long run, we need to break the cycle of violence and radicalization. And you do that through prevention programs and taking a public health approach more.
All right. Well, Mollie, we'll continue to follow the implementation of the strategy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.